The note was 4 inches of paper, and it undid 11 years of silence in one breath. I found it wedged beneath my door on a Tuesday that smelled like rain and old brass, 5 lines of handwritten music with no name attached, no explanation, nothing but a single question scrawled beneath the staff: "Do you know this melody?" I did. I'd known it since I was 7 years old, hummed in a kitchen that didn't exist anymore, by a woman who left a note of her own before she disappeared from my life completely. I told myself it was a coincidence. Coincidences don't make your hands shake. I told myself I wouldn't answer it. I answered it that same night. I didn't know the man next door was hiding a secret that could end everything he'd built to survive. I didn't know I was about to fall in love with someone who communicated in silence because speaking had become the one thing he feared most. I didn't know a piece of paper could hold a whole life inside it. But what happened next changed my life forever. Hollow Bend kept its clocks running a little slow, as if the whole town had quietly agreed that time here didn't need to hurry anywhere. Idris Kavanaugh liked that about the place. He'd inherited his father's shop on Miller Street along with its habit of losing 4 minutes a week, and he'd never once corrected it. Some things were better left slightly behind. The shop smelled of brass polish and cedar shavings, and every surface held something waiting to be brought back to life: a mantel clock with a cracked face, a pocket watch that hadn't ticked since before Idris was born, a shelf of half-finished globes he built in the hours when no customers came in, continents sketched in his own hand, oceans painted the color of dusk instead of the color they were supposed to be. He'd never sold one. He told himself that was because they weren't finished. He didn't examine that answer too closely. He was 29, and he had spent most of those years being told, gently and then not so gently, that the shop was his responsibility now, that a Kavanaugh did not close a business his grandfather had opened with his own 2 hands. He believed it, mostly. On quiet nights, though, he'd trace the coastlines on his unfinished globes and imagine a version of himself standing somewhere none of them had ever been. The house beside the shop had sat empty for 2 years before the moving truck came in March. Idris watched from his workbench window as a man unloaded crates by himself in the rain, refusing help from the driver, moving with the careful economy of someone counting his own movements. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed like he'd stepped out of a decade that valued tailoring, and he never once looked toward the shop. Within a week, Idris understood the shape of his new neighbor's life without ever speaking to him. The lights in that house came on at 9 at night and stayed lit until dawn. The curtains never opened. Twice, past midnight, Idris heard something that might have been a violin, for notes, and then silence, as though the player had stopped himself before the 5th. He didn't ask. Hollow Bend had taught him that everyone carried a version of the same lesson, that some doors were closed for a reason, and prying them open rarely gave you anything but splinters. Then, on a Tuesday in April, he found the note. It was tucked beneath his shop door, folded once, the paper slightly damp from the drizzle outside. 5 lines of a musical staff, drawn by a hand that clearly knew what it was doing, and beneath it, in the same steady ink: "Do you know this melody?" Idris read the notes the way he read the movements of an old clock, slowly, testing whether the mechanism still worked. He didn't need an instrument. The melody rose off the page and into his chest before he'd even finished humming it under his breath, and for one long moment the shop around him disappeared, replaced by a kitchen with yellow curtains and a woman standing at the stove, humming those exact notes like they were the only thing keeping her tethered to the room. His mother had hummed that tune every morning for the first 7 years of his life. She had also written him exactly 1 note before she left it behind, along with everything else. 6 words on a torn page. He still knew where it was, folded into the back of a drawer he never opened. He looked at the paper in his hands and felt his pulse do something it hadn't done in a very long time. He did not know who had written this. He knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that he was going to answer it. Idris did not sleep that night. He sat at his workbench with the note propped against a half-repaired mantel clock, staring at it as though it might rearrange itself into an explanation if he looked long enough. He knew 3 things. He knew the melody. He knew it hadn't come from anywhere but his mother's kitchen, a tune with no title he'd ever found, nothing he could hum to a stranger and expect recognition. And he knew that the only new presence in his life who might plausibly have access to old, obscure music was the silent man next door, the one whose windows stayed dark behind curtains, whose violin, if that's what it was, never made it past 4 notes. He wrote back anyway, because not writing back felt like closing a door he'd spent 11 years wishing someone had left open for him. "I know it," he wrote, on a scrap of the same cream paper he used to label antique parts. "My mother used to hum it. I don't know where it came from. Do you?" He slid it beneath the fence gate that separated the shop's little courtyard from the neighboring house, and told himself he'd feel foolish about it by morning. He did not feel foolish by morning. He felt something closer to hope, which was worse, because hope was a currency he'd spent carelessly once already and had sworn off since. The reply came 2 days later, slipped under his own door sometime in the gray hour before the shop opened. The handwriting was the same unhurried, confident slant. "I learned it from someone who heard it in a music shop, years ago, from a woman passing through. She never gave her name. I've been trying to place it ever since. I didn't expect anyone in this town to know it too." Something in Idris's chest went very still. A woman passing through, humming a melody that belonged to no sheet music, no recording, nothing but memory. It could have been anyone. It could have been exactly who he thought. He wrote back that evening, and this time he let himself ask a real question, not about melodies. "Why don't we just talk? You're right next door." The answer took 3 days, and when it came, it told him more than its actual words did. "I'd rather not, if that's all right. Notes are easier for me right now." I hope that doesn't seem strange. It was strange. It was also, Idris found, oddly familiar, the particular relief of putting a feeling on paper instead of into your own mouth, where it could catch and falter and reveal too much. He'd built an entire drawer of unsold globes around that same instinct. So he answered the only way that felt fair. "It doesn't seem strange to me at all." Over the following 2 weeks, the notes became a rhythm he didn't examine too hard, because examining it might have scared it off. They talked about the melody, and then about the town, and then, carefully, about nothing in particular, the way the river fog rolled in through Miller Street some mornings, the way the bakery 2 doors down always ran out of the good bread by 9. His neighbor wrote in careful, unhurried sentences, as though every word had been chosen for a reason. Idris found himself waiting for the small envelopes the way he used to wait, as a boy, for the tick of the workshop clock to strike the hour. He learned the man's name only because he finally asked directly, and the answer, when it came, was simple. August. No last name. Idris didn't push. He understood, better than he let on, that a name was sometimes the easiest thing to give and the hardest thing to explain. He began sketching a new globe that month, the first one in over a year. He told himself it had nothing to do with the notes arriving under his door. He didn't believe himself even a little. They met properly on a night the rain came down sideways. Idris was locking the shop when he heard something clatter against the wet pavement of the courtyard, a leather case, spilling its contents, sheet music scattering like startled birds. August was on his knees before Idris could think, gathering pages with both hands, and Idris saw for the first time, up close, the tremor. It wasn't dramatic. It was a fine, persistent shake, most visible in August's right hand as he reached for a page just out of grasp, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking directly at it. August noticed him noticing. He went very still. "Let me help," Idris said, crouching, gathering the nearest pages before August could protest. Up close, in the gray wash of rain, August looked younger and more tired than his voice on paper had suggested, dark eyes that tracked Idris's every movement, a jaw set like he was bracing for something. "You don't have to," August said. His voice was quieter than Idris expected, but not the voice of a stranger. It was, unmistakably, the voice that belonged to the handwriting. "I know," Idris said, and kept helping anyway. They ended up in the doorway of the shop, out of the rain, August's case reassembled, both of them dripping and neither quite ready to say goodnight. Idris studied him without meaning to, the elegant, worn coat, the ink-stained fingers, a coiled tension in his shoulders that suggested a man used to being watched and hating it. "You're August," Idris said. "From the notes." "You're Idris." August's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "The clockmaker who knows a melody nobody else does." "I never learned where it came from," Idris admitted. "You said a woman passing through. Do you remember anything else about her?" Something flickered across August's face, calculation, or reluctance, Idris couldn't tell which. "Not much. It was a long time ago. Before I stopped, he stopped himself instead, the sentence unfinished, and looked down at the case in his hands like it had betrayed him. I should get inside. Thank you, for the pages. He left quickly, the kind of quick that wasn't about the rain. Idris stood in the doorway a long while after, replaying the near confession, the way August had swallowed whatever came after stopped. He thought about the 4 notes he'd heard through the wall so many nights, always cut short. He thought about a man who wrote easily and spoke like every sentence cost him something. He almost didn't notice the case had left something behind, a coat, draped over the bench where August had set it down while gathering the music, forgotten in his hurry. Idris lifted it to bring it next door and felt the weight of something stitched into the lining catch beneath his thumb. He shouldn't have looked. He looked anyway. Embroidered in small, faded letters inside the collar was a name. Not August. A different name entirely, one that, absurdly, tugged at a memory Idris couldn't quite place, something he'd heard once on the radio, years ago, attached to a story about a rising young musician whose career had ended before it truly began. He folded the coat carefully and did not go next door that night. The bakery on Miller Street sold bread and, more reliably, gossip, and Idris hated himself a little for using both. Larkin, said Mrs. Oduya, the baker, without much prompting, sliding a loaf across the counter. That's who used to live in that name, before he went and became nobody special next door to you. Vaughn Larkin. You don't remember? Violin prodigy, maybe 15 years back. Played concert halls before he could legally drink. Then it all just stopped. No one really knew why. Some folks said an accident. Some folks said nerves. I always thought it was sadder not knowing. Idris carried that name home like a stone in his pocket, and did not use it. He understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that whatever had happened to Vaughn Larkin was not his to demand answers for. But he understood something else too. The tremor in August's hand hadn't been nerves from the rain. It had been there before the rain, before the notes, before any of this. He left a note of his own that night, no mention of names or violins. I have your coat. No rush picking it up. I hope you're all right. August came the next evening, after the shop had closed, knocking instead of leaving paper for the first time. He stood in the doorway looking like a man who'd rehearsed several sentences and abandoned all of them. You didn't ask, he said finally. About the name in the coat? Idris said. No. You know it, though. This town collects stories like it collects rain. I know a little, Idris admitted. I don't know why you stopped. That part's yours. Something in August's shoulders loosened, fractionally, like a held breath finally let go. He stepped inside, and Idris watched him take in the shop properly for the first time, the clocks in every stage of disassembly, the unsold globes on their shelf, painted oceans the wrong color. You made these? August asked, quieter now. A habit. Nobody buys them. I'm not sure I want them to. August ran a finger along the equator of one, careful, deliberate. Essential tremor, he said, without being asked. That's the medical name for it. It started small. A bow that wouldn't hold steady on a long note. Then it wasn't small anymore. He said it the way you'd recite an old address, a fact stripped of the feeling it used to carry, though Idris could hear, underneath, how much it still cost him. I stopped performing 3 years ago. I stopped talking about it around the same time. It's easier to write than to say out loud that I used to be someone people paid to watch, and now I can't hold a bowing arm steady enough to finish a phrase. Is that why the notes? Idris asked. Easier than talking? Everything is easier than talking, lately. August looked up, and for the first time, held Idris's gaze without flinching from it. Except this, apparently. Neither of them moved to end the conversation there, and for the first time since March, August's curtains were open when Idris walked home past his window that night. Spring settled into Hollow Bend the way it always did, reluctantly, and with it came a new rhythm neither of them named directly. August started appearing at the shop in the evenings, not always with a reason, sometimes simply to sit in the chair by the window while Idris worked, the two of them talking or not talking, whichever the hour called for. It was during one of those evenings, weeks in, that August brought the music box. It was small, tarnished silver, dented on one corner as though it had survived a fall it shouldn't have. "It was my mother's," he said, setting it on the workbench like something fragile in more ways than one. "It hasn't played in years. I don't suppose you fixed these too?" "Everything with a spring and a screw," eventually, Idris said, and reached for his smallest tools. He worked slowly, more slowly than the job required, aware of August's eyes on his hands the whole time, aware of how close they were sitting, close enough that when Idris finally lifted the lid free and the tiny cylinder began, haltingly, to turn, their shoulders were nearly touching. The melody that rose out of the box, tinny and imperfect, was the same 5 notes that had started everything. August went very still. I didn't know it played that." "Neither did I," Idris said, his voice unsteadier than he meant it to be. "My mother used to hum along with it," August said slowly, working something out even as he spoke it. "I always assumed she'd learned it from the box. Not the other way around. Mine used to hum it in the kitchen," Idris said. "Before she left. She wrote me a note instead of saying goodbye. 6 words. I still have it, in a drawer I don't open." He hadn't meant to say that much. It came out anyway, drawn loose by the small machine still turning between them, and August's hand, the trembling one, found Idris's on the workbench, not to steady it, just to be there. "Maybe that's why notes feel safer to both of us," August said quietly. "Because the people who mattered most to us left theirs behind instead of staying to say it." Idris turned his hand beneath August's, palm to palm, and neither of them pulled away. The moment held, fragile as the little silver box, full of things almost said. Then August's phone buzzed on the bench, breaking it. He glanced at the screen and his whole posture changed, the warmth draining out of him in an instant, replaced by something tighter, more frightened. "What is it?" Idris asked. August didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone carefully flat, the way it had been the first time they'd spoken. "An invitation," he said. "To play, one more time. For someone who mattered to me. I have to think about it." He stood, gathering the music box gently, already retreating. "I should go." He left before Idris could ask anything else, and the curtains next door stayed closed for the rest of the week. The silence lasted 11 days, and Idris counted every one of them, though he told himself he wasn't counting. No notes came. The lights next door burned at their usual late hour, but the window stayed dark behind drawn curtains, and twice Idris thought he heard the violin again, not 4 notes this time, but longer phrases, stopping and restarting, like someone circling a wound they weren't ready to touch. He learned, the way Hollow Bend made sure everyone learned everything eventually, what the invitation had been. A memorial concert, 3 weeks out, in the city where August had once performed to sold-out halls, honoring the teacher who'd first put a violin in his hands. The organizers wanted him specifically. Mrs. Oduya said it like gossip. Idris felt it like a diagnosis. He understood the shape of the fear even before he let himself think it through fully. To play again, in public, in front of people who remembered exactly who he'd been, that wasn't a performance. That was an unveiling. And a man who'd spent 3 years hiding a tremor behind closed curtains and silent evenings was not going to walk toward that willingly. Idris wanted, badly, to knock on the door and demand he not disappear into silence the way his own mother had. He didn't. He recognized, with some discomfort, that wanting someone to stay and needing them to feel safe enough to choose it were not always the same thing, and he'd spent enough of his life on the wrong end of someone else's flight to know the difference mattered. So instead, for the first time since April, Idris wrote the first note. He didn't write about the concert. He didn't ask why August had disappeared. He wrote 5 lines of a musical staff, the same 5 notes that had started everything, and beneath it, in his own steady hand, "You don't have to answer this one. I just wanted you to know I'm still here, whenever you're ready to be." He slid it under the gate and went back to his globes, painting an ocean the color of a Tuesday evening, and did not expect an answer that night. He got one 3 mornings later, waiting under his own door when he opened the shop. It was longer than any note before it, the handwriting less careful than usual, as though it had been written in a single unbroken breath. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to go quiet. I don't know how to tell you the truth out loud, so I'm going to try to write it instead, because you've never once made me feel like writing it was a lesser thing to do. Will you come by tonight?" I'd like to actually say something to you, even if my hands shake through the whole sentence. Idris read it twice, then folded it into his pocket where the old note from his mother had lived for 11 years, and for the first time, that felt like the right place for it. August's house, when Idris finally stepped inside it, was nothing like he'd imagined from the drawn curtains and the darkness. It was warm, book-lined, a violin case resting closed on a stand by the window, and on every wall, sheet music framed like art instead of hidden like evidence. "I never let anyone in here," August said, standing near the window with his arms crossed, as though bracing against his own honesty. "Not since I moved." "You're the first." "I'm glad you did," Idris said, and meant it entirely. August exhaled slowly, unfolding his arms, and for once he didn't reach for paper. "I was 15 when it started." Small things, a long bow that trembled at the end of a phrase, a vibrato I couldn't fully control. "I hid it for 2 years. I got very good at hiding it, actually." Then a critic noticed, during a performance that mattered, and wrote about it like it was a scandal instead of a diagnosis. After that I couldn't walk onto a stage without imagining every eye in the room hunting for the shake in my hand. He looked down at that hand now, the same fine tremor visible even in stillness. I stopped talking about music at all, because talking about it meant explaining why I'd stopped, and explaining why I'd stopped meant admitting I was afraid of my own body failing me in front of people who used to admire it. "And the concert," Idris said gently. "The one you're avoiding. It's for the man who taught me everything I know. He's gone now, and everyone who loved him is gathering to remember him with the one thing he loved most, and I am terrified that if I stand up there and my hand shakes through his favorite piece, it will look like disrespect instead of what it actually is." August's voice caught, finally, on the last word. "I don't know how to be seen like this. I built an entire life around not being seen." Idris crossed the room without deciding to, and took August's trembling hand in both of his, not to steady it, exactly, just to hold it the way you'd hold something you didn't want to let go of. "You've been seen by me for months," he said. "Through notes, through silence, through a music box that plays the one melody neither of us can explain. I don't think you're as hidden as you believe you are." August looked at him for a long moment, something breaking open behind his eyes, and then he closed the distance between them and kissed him, careful at first, like every other thing he did, and then not careful at all, both of them holding on like the moment might otherwise slip away as easily as a note under a door. When they finally parted, August rested his forehead against Idris's, breathing unsteadily. "I'm still terrified," he admitted. "I know," Idris said. "I'm not asking you not to be. I'm just asking you to let me stand somewhere in the room while you find out you can do it anyway." The days leading up to the concert unfolded like the slow winding of a clock that had sat too long and used, each hour a little stiff, each movement requiring more effort than it should have. August practiced in the mornings now, curtains open, and Idris would catch fragments of it drifting through the courtyard while he worked, the same piece over and over, a slow, aching melody Idris didn't recognize, interrupted every so often by a frustrated pause when the bow faltered. "It's not about hiding the tremor anymore," August told him one evening, exhausted in the good way, the way that comes from wrestling honestly with something instead of running from it. "My old teacher, the one this whole thing is for, he used to say a shaking hand isn't a broken one. He'd have hated that I built a life around pretending mine had stopped working entirely." "What changed?" Idris asked. "You did, a little. Notes did. Realizing that the version of me people were afraid to look at was never actually as fragile as I believed." August set the violin down, flexing his hand. "I've started adjusting the bowing. Shorter phrases where I need them, more weight through the wrist instead of the fingers. It's not the technique I used to have. It might be a better one, for the hands I have now." Idris thought of his own workbench, of clocks that no longer ran the way their makers intended and had to be recalibrated instead of replaced, of the 4 minutes his own shop clock lost every week and how he'd never once tried to correct it. "Sometimes the mechanism just needs to be understood differently," he said. "Not fixed. Understood." August looked at him like that sentence had landed somewhere important. "You should have been the one giving the eulogy," he said, almost laughing, and pulled Idris in by the front of his shirt to kiss him again, softer this time, less like fear and more like relief. 2 nights before the concert, Idris finished the restoration he'd been quietly working on for weeks without telling anyone, the old mill clock at the center of town, the one that had sat frozen at 447 for over a decade, its mechanism finally cleaned, its chime finally freed. He timed the repair, though he hadn't fully admitted it to himself until he stood there with the last gear seated, that its first chime in 10 years would ring out at the exact hour the concert began, 2 towns away, broadcast on the local station Mrs. Oduya swore half of Hollow Bend still listened to on Sunday nights. It was a small, foolish thing. A clock ringing for a man who couldn't hear it from where he'd be standing. But Idris set the chime anyway, tuned to 5 particular notes he could pick out with his eyes closed, and told himself that some gestures were worth making even if no one but yourself ever knew the reason behind them. The concert hall was the kind of grand, echoing room that made ordinary voices sound smaller and extraordinary ones sound larger, and August stood in the wings of it with his violin case in a hand that would not stay still, no matter how many times he flexed his fingers to steady it. Idris had come, seated near the back where August had asked him to be, close enough to see, far enough not to feel watched himself. He understood why. This night wasn't about an audience of 2. The program moved through its early pieces, tributes from colleagues, a eulogy that drew quiet tears from half the hall, and then August's name was read, and Idris watched him walk out from the wings into the light he had spent 3 years avoiding. He looked, for a moment, exactly as frightened as Idris knew he was. The tremor was visible even from a distance, a small, undeniable shake as he lifted the bow. Somewhere in the hall, a whisper rippled, the particular cruelty of recognition, that's Von Larkin, isn't it, the one who... August closed his eyes. And then he began. The opening phrase faltered, just slightly, exactly the way he'd feared it would, and for one unbearable second Idris thought he might stop entirely, might walk off the stage and never touch an instrument again. But August adjusted instead, shorter strokes, more weight through the wrist, the very recalibration he'd practiced all week, and the faltering became, somehow, part of the music instead of a failure of it. The piece wasn't the polished, flawless performance of the boy prodigy Hollow Bend remembered. It was rawer than that, more honest, a grown man's hands playing a grown man's grief, tremor and all, and the hall went utterly silent around it. Idris thought, distantly, of his own clock in the square, chiming its 5 notes at exactly this hour, and hoped, absurdly, that some thread of it reached this room the way music had once reached across a shop counter between 2 strangers who only knew each other through paper. When the final note faded, the silence held a beat longer than silence should, and then the applause broke like something damned too long, rising until it filled every corner of the hall. Not polite applause. Not sympathetic applause. The kind reserved for something the audience understood they'd just been given, not performed for. August stood there, breathing hard, his bow hand still trembling, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't try to hide it. He let it shake in full view of everyone who had once been afraid to see it, and no one in that room looked away in pity. They looked at him like he'd finally arrived somewhere he'd been circling for years. Backstage, afterward, he found Idris waiting exactly where he'd promised to be, and said nothing at all, just crossed the space between them and held on, shaking hand and steady one both, like a man finally certain he wouldn't need to write it down to be understood. They walked back into Hollow Bend 2 days later on the evening train, the town gathering its usual fog along the river, the mill clock chiming its restored notes across the square as they crossed it, and August stopped mid-step to listen, really listen, to the melody ringing out over the rooftops. "You did that," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I fixed a clock," Idris said. "The timing was mostly luck." "Nothing about you has been luck," August said, and there was no fear left in the way he said it. They stood together outside the shop that had started everything, its windows still lined with unfinished globes, and Idris found himself, for the first time in over a year, imagining finishing one not to sell, but simply because the ocean deserved its right color at last. He told August as much, quietly, the way you tell someone a thing you've only recently allowed yourself to want. "I'm not leaving the shop," Idris said. "Not entirely. But I don't want it to be the only thing I ever finish, either." "Then don't let it be," August said. "Fix the clocks. Paint the oceans. I'm not going anywhere you'd need a note to find me." Idris laughed, surprised by how much lighter the words made him feel, 11 years of a locked drawer suddenly less heavy in his chest. "No more notes, then?" "One more," August said, and reached into his coat, drawing out a small folded page, offered directly into Idris's hand instead of slipped beneath any door. "The last one I'll ever need to give you this way." Idris unfolded it slowly. It wasn't music this time. It was 4 words, plain and unhidden, written in a hand that no longer needed paper to say true things, only chose to, because some truths deserve to be kept. I choose to stay. Idris looked up, and August was already there, close enough that the paper between them barely mattered anymore, and when their hands found each other this time, neither one was shaking with fear. Above them, the restored clock chimed the last of its 5 notes into the evening air, a melody that had once meant losing someone, now finally, completely, meaning the opposite.